Welcome, everybody. I'm very happy to have this event, the first one of the IFPH Explorers for 2025. Also, this is a very special year for Explorers because we are commemorating 5 years. And also, today's guest is going to address one of my favorite topics ever. So I think it's also like a good sign for for the year, despite all the things that are happening in the United States right now. So I'm going to introduce our guest and then I'll give her the floor. Today we have with us Joanna Page. She's going to talk about reinventing cabinets of curiosities in contemporary Latin American art. Joanna Page is a professor of Latin American Studies and director of the Center of Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, CRASH, at the University of Cambridge. Between 2014 and 2018, she directed the Center of Latin American Studies at Cambridge. Her research interests are connected to the relationship between science and culture in Latin America, but she has also worked on questions of memory, modernity, capitalism, posthumanism, new materialism, decoloniality, ecology, and environmental thought. She has published several monographs, the most recent of which are The Colonizing Science in Latin American Art, it's open access from 2021, and the colonial ecologies, the reinvention of natural history in Latin American art, also open access 2023. Joanna, thank you very much for accepting the Explorers invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jimena. Thank you very much for the invitation. Great to meet all of you who are here in the Zoom room, but also hi to everybody who's going to be watching the recording later. I'm just going to share my screen with you. So Jimena's already given the title of the talk. And really going to start with thinking about cabinets of curiosities, which were immensely popular in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. The earliest illustration that we have of a cabinet of curiosities is this one. It's from a book published by an apothecary from Naples in 1599, and it shows his own collection. Cabinets lost their appeal in the early 18th century when attention turned to more systematic ways of collecting and representing natural history. But their attraction has really endured in a lot of ways. So some of them are still in existence, like the Kunstkamera in St. Petersburg. Some of them evolved into bigger museums like the Ashmolean in Oxford. There have also been some new creations like this one in the Houston Museum of Natural Science from 2018, which pays homage to the role of wonder and curiosity in the history of public museums. Recently, artists have also been inspired by cabinets of curiosities to create works that hark back to an age before the Enlightenment, an era that's often been described as pre-scientific, but more accurately, we could think of it as a period in which what we now recognize as scientific knowledge emerged alongside other kinds of knowledge and belief. In an age in which the mysteries of nature hadn't yet been tamed into rigid taxonomies, and when anomalies were more interesting than universal systems and laws. Artists have been exploring cabinets of curiosities in our own time for many reasons. For example, to critique the reductionism of modern science, to highlight the relationship between collections and colonialism, or to convey ideas about environmental change and our relationship with the natural world. Mark Dion, and you can see an example of one of his works here. He's an artist who's dedicated a lot of his career to exploring natural history collections as a way of raising questions about how museums and other institutions shape our knowledge of history and the natural world. And he's often experimented with the format of the cabinet of curiosities. He says he's drawn to them because of their idiosyncrasy, but also because he finds them to be, and I'm quoting from him here, exciting models of interactivity aimed at inspiring wonder and active engagement rather than the passive reception of information. So I'm going to focus for the first part of this talk on Baroque cabinets of curiosities in Europe, what they contained, how they were arranged, what they communicated about the natural world and our relationship with it. I'm then going to move on to introduce some recent works by Latin American artists that play in really interesting ways with that genre of the Cabinet of Curiosities, reinventing it for our own era. And I've chosen two artists to focus on, Pablo Lapadula from Argentina and Cristian Villavicencio from Ecuador. What I'm going to present today is part of a broader research project on recent works of art in Latin America that are inspired by natural history collections of the past. So towards the end, I'm going to broaden out and talk a bit about that larger project. So the Baroque cult of curiosities in Europe led to the creation of prized collections. These were owned by royals, nobles, wealthy merchants. They contained fabulous objects drawn from the furthest reaches of the known world. And they included items of high monetary value, such as precious stones, also ones that had supernatural powers ascribed to them. So, for example, unicorn horns, which were thought to have great healing powers, basilisks, which, according to legend, were serpents that caused death to anybody looking into their eyes, and dragon's blood, which was a type of resin that was used to cure many diseases. Each object in the cabinet was prized for its rarity, its uniqueness, the difficulty involved in bringing it back from far off lands, or the excellence of its craftsmanship. And these 16th and 17th century collections were vastly enriched by objects arriving from the Spanish and Portuguese empires. These offered exotic crafts and unusual zoological or botanical specimens. And so cabinets of curiosities were really created at the intersection between natural history and colonialism. The collecting of specimens was a colonial and capitalist practice that was at the heart of natural history as an emerging field of knowledge. The objects that were displayed in European cabinets were so rich and abundant and varied that they conjured up a vision of the immense diversity of the world. And when we look at these at first sight, the collections seem quite chaotic and disordered to us. Actually, they were far from unstructured, but many of their exhibits were admired because of their resistance to classification. And so there was a particular fascination for specimens that seemed to bridge the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms, like corals, which look like plants or rocks, but are in fact animals. And cabinet creators were also really keen to explore transformations in nature. So they often gave an important place to fossils because fossils were evidence of a conversion from one kingdom to another, from organic plant or animal matter to mineral. Cabinets also included intricately crafted objects, such as carved ivory and wood, as well as mechanical devices such as automata, because these also defied boundaries. For example, boundaries between art and nature or life and machine. And often these objects were brought together in a way that created visual symmetries or analogies between them. So the way that they were arranged allowed viewers to see points of similarity, even between objects of a completely different nature or that came from different places. And those juxtapositions would then provoke ontological questions like, what is it that unites all living things despite their huge diversity? What's the relationship between nature and art? The wonderful creations of nature versus the wonderful creations of artists? Or can nature be understood as creator as well as creation? Cabinets of curiosities also emphasized transgressions over universal laws and taxonomies. And they brought a lot of drama and spectacle out of those creative entanglings of nature and culture. And these are some of the ways in which they were really very different from the more systematic natural history collections that were largely to replace them by the time that we got into the 18th century in Europe. So the first artist of our time that I'm going to introduce is the artist whose work that you can see on the slide there, Pablo Lapadula, who works in Argentina. He's a physiologist as well as an artist, and his installations often bridge the worlds of science and art. He's created several gabinetes biológicos or biological cabinets for museums and art galleries. And these draw on some of the characteristics of European cabinets of curiosities, as well as other kinds of natural history collection. So they create a similar kind of awe and curiosity in visitors. But as I'm going to suggest, they also contain a critique of some of the colonial and capitalist forces behind those earlier collections. So here you can see an image from an exhibition called Zoología Fantástica or Fantastical Zoo. And in his cabinets, La Padula brings together a lot of different objects, including fossils, bones, shells, dried leaves, other specimens taken from the natural world. And those are interspersed with books, lab equipment like flasks or specimen jars, and also works of art that he's created in the form of figures made of smoke on glass. And everything, as you can see here, is arranged on large light tables and enclosed in very simple display boxes. Baroque cabinets of curiosities were very personal collections. So whatever went into them was what the collector decided to include, and usually what they found on their travels. And in just the same way, La Padula's cabinets are also filled with objects that he has found while traveling, or that are linked to his practice as a lab scientist. But they also include a fossil given to him by a friend, stones there that are gathered on a trip away, to which particular memories are attached, old books from his childhood. So as visitors, we can only really guess at these very personal associations. But the way that the objects have been selected and arranged does invite us to speculate about what other logics might be in play here. What other connections might he be suggesting by this arrangement? And I'm going to suggest that the way that the objects are placed in relation to each other does communicate particular ideas about the natural world and particularly its unity and diversity. So objects are often positioned in a way that helps us see the visual resemblances between them. As I mentioned earlier, visual analogy was one of the most important organizing principles in Baroque cabinets. Here it's also used to help us see similarities between the structure and function of features shared between species. So here we can see parts of the skeleton of a dolphin with the vertebrae and ribs branching out. And that form echoes the fanned pattern created with smoke on paper below and to the left. That pattern also resembles the form of the lobed leaves that are placed on either side of it. Standing between a lot of the objects are glass sheets that I think you should be able to see them there and some other images as well. Often these have got representations of atoms and chemical bonds on them. And these seem to unite all of these objects. So they bind together objects of nature, objects of human design, the organic, the inorganic, animal, vegetable, mineral, art, and nature. And the illustrations made with smoke also point to carbon as the common denominator of life on the planet. So very much like early modern cabinets then, Zoología Fantástica stages this unity of nature in its diversity. And in a really similar way, it blurs the boundaries between nature and art and technology. But in other ways, La Padula's cabinets are really quite different from Baroque ones. In their book Wonders and the Order of Nature, Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park write that in the Baroque period, wonders were also commodities to be bartered, sold, bought, and collected. So they had a market value. By contrast, La Padula's objects do not. In fact, a lot of the specimens that he brings together don't have any value at all from an economic perspective, or even a scientific ones. These are quite ordinary fossils, or leaves or bones. And on principle, he buys nothing for these cabinets. So his own practice of collecting is carried out completely outside of the capitalist system of gallery and museum acquisitions. La Padula replaces then the Baroque emphasis on the rare and the exceptional, with an emphasis on the everyday. He includes objects that have been discarded, also, or that are obsolete, or remains that are incomplete. He even includes objects in his exhibitions that are byproducts of his own scientific and artistic activities, things that would normally be thrown out as waste. So behind the dolphin's remains are lab flasks containing the candle wax that he dropped when he made the smoke images. Nearby, there's a microscope slide containing proteins that had been used in the process of writing a scientific paper. Both art and science normally show us the elegance and beauty of the final result. The painting, not the sketches that an artist started with, or the clarity of a scientific paper, not all the experiments, including the failed ones, that led up to it. But of course, what's disposed of is absolutely essential to the process of producing both art and science. And Lapadula puts it in this way. He says, the existence of everything that is thrown away makes possible the simple, beautiful abstraction of the scientific paper. So he's finding a second use for these byproducts, these objects that might have been discarded. And again, it's partly a way of encouraging us to ask, what is the value of these objects? Why have they been exhibited here? Many of these objects, unlike the ones in Baroque cabinets, are not ones that have a value that we would recognize in economic, scientific, or artistic terms. But assembled together, they seem to acquire a different kind of value that has to do with curiosity or a sense of play. And it's really remarkable, I think, how the techniques of display that he uses makes even these most ordinary objects seem fascinating. And to go to one of his exhibitions is to see lots of visitors pouring over the cabinets, really generating a lot of interest. A lot of science museums today are encouraging that sense of play and wonder through a greater and greater use of interactivity. Or digital creativity and virtual reality. And La Padula deliberately is creating installations that are as far as possible from the kind of high-tech formats of a lot of science exhibitions today. He wants to create an art that he refers to as Paleolithic as possible. He says an art with the environmental impact of a caveman. And the main technology that he uses is really very simple. The projection of light through drawings on transparent sheets of glass. This is really effective and it creates quite a magical play of light and shadows and perspective that makes even the plainest objects seem fantastical. But it uses very little energy beyond that of a light bulb. And this is one of the things that makes the environmental footprint of his cabinets very small. So La Padula's cabinets share a lot of the features of Baroque cabinets, but he's really reinvented the format for a time in which we are more and more aware of the colonial underpinnings of natural history collections and how they're caught up in systems of capitalist acquisition. His cabinets, on the other hand, encourage us to find the magical in objects that are not expensive and exotic, but are ordinary and everywhere around us, and represent something of our own everyday encounter with the natural world. So in that way, his collections are also addressing that Baroque question of the relationship between nature and culture. They show that in the very act of collecting objects, the natural becomes cultural. As well as natural wonders and works of art, cabinets of curiosities of the 16th and 17th century often displayed technical devices such as microscopes and telescopes, which at the time was starting to transform perceptions of the natural world in a radical way. Some of the works created by the Ecuadorian artist Christian Villavicencio also display natural specimens and technical devices together in a similar way to cabinets of curiosities. But his devices include more modern technologies, as you might expect, such as cameras and projectors alongside microscopes. And often those devices encourage us to question the role of visual technologies in how we understand and relate to the world. The 18th century natural history collections that in many cases supplanted cabinets of curiosities tried to adopt a much more objective approach to the natural world. So I talked earlier about the theatrical experience of the Baroque cabinets. It was one that stimulated many senses. These were objects that you could go in and pick up and touch. By contrast to that, Enlightenment scientists placed all of their trust in vision. The vision was the sense that they considered to be the most reliable and objective. And what many of Villavicencio's works do is challenge that apparent objectivity of vision as a tool of knowledge. And they try to reconnect us via other senses with the natural world in ways that are a lot more subjective and embodied. So this is a table that was displayed as a work called Selecciones, but it was also then used as an element in bigger installations. And I'm going to show you a video that gives you a sense of how the work is put together. Most of the specimens were borrowed from the biology department of the National Polytechnic School in Ecuador. You can see there's a display box with a colorful array of beetles, dragonflies, and other insects. There are skeletons of a porcupine and a sloth. And at the back, you can just see there's a jar with a snake in formaldehyde. These items belong to an archive that was founded in the 19th century and catalogued according to the Linnaean system. But here they've been combined with other heterogeneous objects and theatricalized in a way that's much more reminiscent of earlier cabinets of curiosities. So all of these objects are interspersed with and mediated by different visual technologies. You can see there a 3D printed model of a fossil, and a lot of the specimens are placed on rotating discs and filmed by tiny cameras. You can see in the background there that the moving images are projected onto screens nearby. A lot of those video sequences are shot in extreme close-up. And that has a very disorientating and defamiliarizing effect because what we're seeing is textures and colors, but not always the larger complete forms that would help us classify what we're seeing as examples of particular species. So normally when we look at the whole of a beetle box, we can see how each species relates to the others that are placed alongside it. So their similarities, but also their differences in color or size or shape that would help us identify a particular species. But when the camera zooms right in, all we see is textures and surfaces. So this juxtaposition of two different kinds of vision really encourages us to focus on what becomes visible or invisible in each, how the use of devices to alter scale and perspective shapes our understanding of what we see. And in some versions of the exhibition, the video was projected onto rotating screens, and these had the effect of appearing to stretch and shrink the images, so creating a further set of distortions. And then these gyrating screens often encouraged viewers to move around the exhibition because they had to shift and move around in order to be able to view the videos. I mentioned that the specimens used here were borrowed from the National Polytechnic School. That was founded in 1869 as Ecuador's first research center. It was initially overseen by German Jesuits. And the natural history collections there really bear the imprint of that European influence in their organization. And for Villavicencio, they represent the nation's very enthusiastic embrace of Western positivism. And that positivism held that knowledge comes from empirical evidence, what can be observed. And as I said, for 18th and 19th century scientists, vision was therefore the most reliable source of knowledge. So what Villavicencio does in Selecciones is highlight the important role that visual technologies play in our understanding of the natural world. But he also uses those technologies in ways that diverge from the apparently objective view that we think that scientific instruments gives us. So as the artist himself put it, what would an alternative history of microscopic surfaces look like if we were to reject the viewpoint of a disinterested observer? These clinical tools can be used to discover things that Western science had no intention of discovering or did not know how to, or how to look for them. Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison, in their book Objectivity on Modern Science, they tell us that machines seem to offer freedom from subjectivity, being ignorant of theory and incapable of speculation. So mechanical objectivity, they argue, became a guiding, if not the guiding ideal of scientific representation across a lot of disciplines. And the idea was to erase the self and to adopt a kind of neutral position from which we could observe the world accurately. In Villavicencio's work, on the other hand, technologies are not used to distance us from the world, but to bring us into a much more intimate encounter with it, and one that often appeals to other senses as well. So the close-ups that he uses, the very kind of this emphasis, this disorientating emphasis on surfaces, colors, textures, all of these sequences effectively disrupt this kind of smooth, static, objective gaze. And when that happens, it becomes more obvious to us how those technologies mediate our knowledge of the world. And by using cameras in this way, Villavicencio is suggesting that our vision is always distorted by the instruments that we're using, and that we may encounter the world differently, or even encounter different worlds by using different instruments or using the same ones differently. The unfamiliar visions that his exhibitions create encourage us to question our understanding of the world and how this has been shaped by the totalizing, objectifying perspectives that became central to scientific modes of observation in the 18th century. And in his exploration of the relationship between the eye, body, and machines, Villavicencio found points of contact with the work of Jonathan Crary, who wrote on 19th century visual technologies. And Crary maintains that optical devices are not ever simply material objects. He reminds us that they're embedded in a much larger assemblage of events and powers. So in his other works, Villavicencio explores different means through which we might encounter the world, such as sound or touch and the perception of vibrations. And these create a much more intimate relationship with what we're observing or encountering. Cabinets of curiosities became less popular and influential because for the scientists who came afterwards, systematic observation was more important than curiosity and wonder in how we created knowledge about nature. So Enlightenment science emphasized systems and technology, taxonomies, and the rules that govern the natural world, rather than the anomalies or the oddities of cabinets of curiosities. So I think there are three main reasons why there's been a new interest in cabinets of curiosities on the part of these artists and others. The first is that we realize that inspiring wonder about the natural world may be one of the most effective ways of protecting biodiversity and the health of ecosystems in an era of massive decline. Baroque cabinets communicated a vision of the oneness of the world in its vast diversity. And it's this vision that has taken on new meaning for us, I think, in a context in which we understand more and more how interconnected our ecosystems are and the impact of human activities on biodiversity. The second reason has to do with a wider critique of the kind of modern science that's been produced since the Enlightenment. which consolidated itself by excluding other forms of knowledge and claiming a kind of universality that was based on this objective, distanced observation. And the works that I've been looking at by Lapadula and Villavicencio foster alternative encounters with the natural world that hark back to the more personal, affective relationships that shaped Baroque collections. And a third reason I think that cabinets of curiosities have become important again is that, as we've seen, can be reframed within a critique of capitalism and colonialism. Walter Benjamin identifies the Baroque ideal of knowledge as one of stockpiling. So it was in this period that many of the great libraries and collections of Europe were founded. And recent cabinets of curiosities encourage us to question the relationship between scientific knowledge and accumulation. And of course, this feeds into a much bigger debate about museum acquisitions and collections and the extent to which these are still embedded in imperial relations. Um, Before I stop, I just wanted to say something about the broader research project that this exploration is located in. Cabinets of curiosities are just one of the historical methods of collecting, organizing, and displaying nature that have been reinvented recently by Latin American artists. And my latest book focuses on those, but also other forms and genres as well, including the medieval bestiary, atlases created by European travelers to the New World, the floras and herbaria composed by 18th and 19th century naturalists, as well as the dioramas that were designed for natural history museums in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is the book here. It's called Decolonial Ecologies, the Reinvention of Natural History in Latin American Art. And that link will take you to an open access version that you can view or download. So in different ways, a lot of those artistic projects that I explore in the book critique the continued dominance across the world of a particular system of knowledge that was consolidated in Western Europe and that can't be separated from Europe's exercise of power in the world. And in that critique, they often hark back to pre-Enlightenment collections as a way of rescuing something that got lost in the Enlightenment. Boaventura de Sousa Santos emphasizes that Europe's expansionism resulted in what he calls epistemicide, the systematic destruction of other forms of knowledge. The early colonizers of America benefited enormously from indigenous knowledge. And in the early years, there was quite a lot of exchange, genuine exchange between different forms of knowledge. But by the time that we get to the scientific expeditions that set out from Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries to map and measure Latin America, a lot of that local knowledge is being replaced by the universalizing systems and taxonomies that were developed during the Enlightenment. So a lot of the artists that I've been studying critique the relationship between science and the extraction or erasure of indigenous knowledge. And they also attempt to reconnect Western science with other forms of knowledge and practice that have been systematically excluded since the Enlightenment. Just to give you a few brief examples, Fabiano Cueva, another artist from Ecuador, he's developed a broad project over several years on Humboldt's universal science, showing how it led to both extractivism and epistemicide. And he's created performances, herbaria exhibitions, and video essays. And in these, Humboldt emerges as a central figure in the European exercise of knowledge by accumulation. And that involved the removal of thousands of specimens, samples, and artifacts from Latin America to Europe, where they're classified and studied, and where most of them still remain in closely guarded museums and depositories. These are works by Valmor Correa from Brazil, who recreates figures from indigenous legends and colonial manuscripts, collecting them together in ways that point to the work of medieval bestiary writers. But at the same time, he's using the visual idiom of modern Western anatomy textbooks. And the Colombian artist Alberto Baraja creates herbaria that don't show plants and flowers extracted from their environment, as colonial botanists did, but reinsert them in their cultural, social, and economic context. So he adds photos of where he found them or maps showing their routes to global markets. And when we realize that these flowers are all plastic ones made in China, that adds to the critique of the commodification of nature that Baraja's work develops. I'm going to stop there, but I'd be very happy to answer questions on anything I've mentioned or other aspects of that broader project.
Excuse me, there seems to be a technical difficulty. I want to ask if you are seeing me and listening to me correctly. Yes?
Yes, no
There's
problem from my
no problem.
perspective.
There's from my end, there's some kind of distortion of the screen. I hope it's only my end, but if you're seeing everything correct, I'm just gonna leave it there. So I'm glad to hear that. Joanna, thank you very much. This was really, really really engaging and really fascinating, at least for me. Before making a comment, I would like to give the word to the audience. If you have questions or comments for Joanna, I would ask you to please unmute yourselves because from my end I cannot see the chat. So and just jump in if you have questions or comments for her. So while people um, um, are brave enough to ask you a question, I would like to make a comment. Well, first of all, I'm not an artist. I am let's say, more like an armchair historian, if you want. So this is like really important for me, and it reminded me of a Colombian case that I have studied of a small grassroots museum that don't call themselves as museums because they think museums are for the dead people. And what they call museums are museums of natural history. And they think that all that is in a natural history museum, like the insects we saw there and that, are part of the past and are things that are dead, that they don't
Hmm.
really give any information about the present. And what caught my attention about these cabinets that you presented here is that they're doing the total opposite, uh, which for me is it's very, very interesting because it also means that they're giving like the exhibitions and the museums also a different meaning. It's
Mm.
also like a very deep critique that I think it's really, really important. So I that caught my attention uh, immediately. I don't know if you would like to tell us a little bit more about like that part
Yeah, I mean, I
the
think
museum.
interesting that you brought up the question of the artist perspective here, because I think what happens to these natural history collections when they are put in the hands of artists is that they become more than just the sum of their objects, right? That the artists are also suggesting something about museums or about how collections like these shape our understanding of the world. And they're trying to intervene in that relationship, if you like. So that's, if you like, what makes this an artist installation and not just a natural history collection, although, of course, it can perform those two functions at the same time.
Yeah, but that critique about like the objective knowledge, I think it's also like very important thinking about certain museums today that still have that structure that they are there to impart knowledge as the way things
Mm.
have to be, and that we know that that's not the case. So I think this was really kind of inspiring in a way, like to think and look at things differently. It was very interesting for me. So I open it again for the audience, or if you have any comments, or if you would like to, I don't know. I would like to ask you also, oh, I'm sorry, Malena, go ahead.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was thinking about the idea of curiosity behind this idea of cabinet. And sometimes I think this idea of curiosity is always positive, or the idea of being curious. It's
Mm-hmm.
like a good value, and something you have to have highlight. And this idea is tied with the idea of collecting or making collections, and it's typical of maybe 18th century. I don't know, and I don't know if you are or you investigate this idea of curiosity at that time, or how, because the curiosity is like an emotion, and at that time in the 18th century maybe it's a positive value. And when you presented the artists, the contemporary artists, I think that this idea maybe disappear or transform into something else. And I would like to know if you explore this idea of curiosity, or the emotion of curiosity.
Mm.
And thank
That's
you.
really interesting, because as you say, curiosity is an emotion, but I think it's an emotion that we can historicize because
Yeah,
people have been curious about different things in different ways at different points of
yeah.
history. And what would have made people in sort of early modern periods curious is a little bit different from what we find curious now. Although I think it's very clear that these contemporary artists are also highlighting some similarities, that we are just generally fascinated by the natural world and the kind of exquisite or exotic, but also the everyday, and the shapes and forms of it and what our relationship is with the natural world. I'm going to see if I can share an image. Let me just get out of this, that will show you a little bit clearer. Because one of the ideas that was very common in Baroque cabinets was this idea of a playful nature. And of course, play has a lot to do with the idea of curiosity, the sense of the kind of childlike way in which we might approach, the universe. I can show you here. This is going back to one of La Padula's work again. And you can see there, in the middle there, you can see some of these little figures that I referred to that are created out of smoke, on these kind of little glass inserts that he has. And those really, I think, to me, convey a sense of curiosity and play because they're miniaturized. And these little figures are adrift in this world of giant bones and fossils and leaves. And what I think is very interesting is that he's actually, in a sense, you could read it as a twist on that Baroque understanding of curiosity and play, that it used to be nature that was playful, whereas now it's humans. These figures are meant to represent humans, that we, almost the idea that we need to recover that sense of being playful in the natural world. But for a lot of these artists, obviously, the point of that curiosity was not simply to marvel at the richness of these collections, but actually to understand the value of a natural world that's in decline. So there's a kind of different message that's behind that curiosity. But I don't know if anyone has ever written a history of curiosity, but it would be an amazing book to write,
I
to
don't
think of the different
remember the
forms that
name.
it's
There
taken.
is an historian, but I don't remember the name who's working about that. But I think it's a history of emotions for sure.
Yes.
Mhm.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah, but
Thank you.
there's an idea. I would read that immediately. Immediately. Another thing that I wanted to say, it's more, I don't know if it's a question, it's more like a comment. Like the cabinets of curiosities of the 17th and 18th centuries that were like meant to show how the world was an exotic place. And now this this modern, if I can say that word, format that use the same format of the cabinets, but to show precisely that that's not exotic, that that's knowledge and that has been there forever. I find that really, really interesting. Do you think the artist did that on purpose, like as a critique, or it was just a way they found to express what they wanted.
Do you mean using objects that are not exotic, or
No,
objects
no,
that are more everyday?
like using the format of a cabinet, of curiosities.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it was a deliberate uh, way to create a relationship with those earlier forms. That's something that I saw in a lot of these works that I investigated for the book, that returning to pre-Enlightenment forms of collections was a way of critiquing the Enlightenment, um, but also a way of rescuing something that they saw as being beneficial. So, to give you another example, some of the bestiary writers and artists that I've been looking at for the contemporary end go back to medieval bestiaries, which were collections of texts and images about animals. You know, some of these were real animals, some of them were fantastical, invented animals. But a lot of them were about visual correspondences between different parts of the world, between animals and plants, or between um, heaven and earth, or an idea of a vision of the world that everything was connected and united. And that vision got displaced in the Enlightenment when particularly natural history became much more about differences than about some kind of essential similarity. And yet, I think that idea of similarity and the connection between all of the elements of the biophysical world, that's becoming more important in a lot of environmental philosophy these days, for example, that it becomes important to think about the interconnectedness of everything, everything that is alive and everything that gives support to that life. So there's a kind of way in which they're seeing something of those medieval collections that is more relevant to our own philosophies and thinking about the environment today than Enlightenment collections. So there's a deliberate attempt to go back to earlier genres in order to kind of take from them, rescue something that got lost when all of those collections got replaced by, much more serious collections that took place in the Enlightenment.
Okay. I don't want to like hoard all the questions, but if nobody asks, I have another question, but it's more like um it's not so related to to your presentation, but it's part of my curiosity, if I can use the word. I was thinking about the Pitt Rivers Museum.
Yeah.
Um, would that be a cabinet of curiosities?
That's a very interesting question. So the Pitt Rivers was actually established later, but it does share a lot of characteristics with Baroque cabinets, partly because it was a very personal collection um, created by an explorer. And it does have a number of elements that we would have associated with cabinets of curiosity. So the really famous items are the shrunken heads that everybody wants to go and see, which were related to kind of tribal practices in Africa. I don't remember exactly which tribes. So they contain a lot of things that we would think of as curiosities and quite exotic objects. But it was created later than these kind of Baroque cabinets, which is an interesting case because obviously what I'm presenting has been sort of a simplification, a kind of schematic periodization. But I did suggest earlier in the start of my talk that actually the attraction of these cabinets never really goes away. So it's not true to say that they're completely supplanted by more kind of rationalist scientific collections that come afterwards. They keep popping up in different places and some of them endure. And I think the Pitt Rivers is a really good example, of that.
Yeah, I was thinking about I was there many, many years ago, but I was thinking about the tarantula they have there. I don't know if they
Uh-huh.
still have it. It says tarantula from Bogota, and in Bogota, maybe in Colombia, I know that there's no tarantulas in Bogota, but I also the first time I saw that I was like, what's this? But then I understood like all the meaning behind it, and I find it like really, really, really interesting. I don't know, Joanna, if there's no more questions, if you want to add something else, if you want to make a comment, if you, I don't know.
No, nothing particularly, but if anybody is interested in knowing more, do feel free to contact me. You can find my email on the University of Cambridge website. Very happy to hear from anybody.
I will circulate this video, and also if somebody asks me about your email, I won't give it to them. I will just redirect them to the page you
That's
came in.
fine. It's very public, my email.
Yeah, but I won't, I usually don't give information when people tell me, oh, tell me how to find this person. I would say, okay, go to go to this page. So, if there are no more questions or comments, I would like to thank, on behalf of the International Federation for Public History, I would like to thank Joanna Page for this very, very, very interesting uh, presentation. I think really it was like, I mean, it's fascinating for me. I hope this also make more readers go to your books. And our next presentation is going to be on February 11. We're going to talk about the development of public history in China, if somebody is interested. So thank you very much for attending the Explorers, and good year for all.
Bye.